Welcome to my series of basketball videos where I'll be comparing various NBA grades against each other. I'm doing this because I find that a lot of the basketball videos comparing players on YouTube are too focused on the big names, and sometimes compare players from different positions. For example, lots of people compare Jordan to LeBron and Kobe to Duncan, just because of their similar levels of achievements, but since those players play different positions and have different styles of play, it's not an interesting comparison. In this series, I want to do a comparison not between just more well-known players, but players from days past, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and even the ABA as well, that most modern fans probably do not have too much knowledge about. Also, as much as possible, I want to compare players that play similar positions and have similar play styles. To me, that's a more interesting and fruitful comparison. I'll be using 6 different metrics to compare each player. The first category is scoring. This category will be defined by each player's career points per game, peak points per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of scoring titles. Rebounding. This category will be defined by each player's career rebounds per game, peak rebounds per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of rebounding titles. Passing. This category will be defined by each player's career assists per game, peak assists per game both regular season and playoffs, and number of assist titles. Efficiency and advanced metrics. This category will be defined by each player's career true shooting percentage per and win shares per 48, both in the regular season and playoffs. The reason I use true shooting percentage is because it's more fair to guards. Field goal percentage tends to be biased to big men because of their height and play style closer to the basket. I also put in win shares per 48 here because it encompasses efficiency along with other attributes to give you an idea of how many wins a player contributes to his team. Defense. This category will be defined by each player's all defensive selections, defensive win shares, and defensive player of the year awards. The reason I'm not using blocks and steals in this comparison is because I want to compare the achievements of older players that modern fans might not have too much knowledge about, and players in the 1960s and early 1970s do not have steals and blocks tracked. Awards. This category will be defined by All-Star appearances, All-NBA selections, MVPs, Finals MVPs, and championships as the first, second, or third best player. The reason I have to only count championships as a top 3 player on the team is because otherwise you get into the situation where, for example, Robert Horry has 7 rings and Karl Malone has 0, and it's not representative of how much better a player is if they weren't a top 3 player on their team contributing to a championship. I know including All-Star selections is a little bit controversial because it's fan voted, but ultimately this is what the Hall of Fame uses in their criteria to induct a player, as unfair as it sounds. Also, I'll be including ABA stats and awards and using them as equivalent to their respective NBA stats and awards. The only one that's different about the ABA is that instead of Finals MVP, they have Playoffs MVP, which honestly is a better idea than Finals MVP since it accounts for the whole playoffs, but just to keep it simple, I'll be referring to the ABA Playoffs MVP as Finals MVP here. Also, no All-NBA third team selections are counted, because All-NBA third teams weren't added until the late 80s, which is unfair to older players. Also, I'm not using any career total stats because that's a longevity thing. For example, no one would say that Karl Malone was a better scorer than Michael Jordan, even though he has more total points. And of course, this is only going to be my opinion from comparing the available metrics, since I have not watched most of these players live, or even been born when some of these players have been playing. And to keep it fair, I'm judging them based on how they did in their own era. No time travel or what if this NBA player played in today's era or the 1960s, none of that. I'll be strictly basing their stats and accomplishments within their own era against that era's competition, which makes the most sense to me. So I hope you guys enjoy this comparison video and hopefully learn something new from it. The 5th episode in the series examines 2 dominant centers, both athletic, tall, strong, lengthy specimens who were frustrating for offenses to play against. David Robinson was the anchor for a good but not championship-level Spurs team, but later famously teamed up with Tim Duncan to finally get over the hump. While Artis Gilmore, one of the most underrated players of all time, was an ABA superstar who led his Kentucky Colonels to a championship before finishing his career as a solid all-star level player for the Bulls and the Spurs. Let's take a look at how these two compare and see who had the greater career. In this category, the decision is not that difficult, because while Gilmore was a very capable scorer, averaging 18.8 points per game for his career, peaking at 24.6 per game in 1976, and 17.7 points per game in the playoffs, peaking at 24.2 in 1976, he was not the primary offensive weapon for his team while he was in the prime in the ABA. That was Dan Issel. And while he had a decent postgame and could easily shoot and dunk over defenders with his strength and height, Gilmore's offensive moves were quite limited. In comparison, David Robinson had a much more polished offensive game and was the primary scorer for his team until his later years when he teamed up with Tim Duncan. This is reflected in his career averages of 21.1 points per game with a very nice peak of 29.8 points per game in 1994, winning the scoring title that year, scoring 71 points to win it. In the playoffs, he averaged a more pedestrian 18.1 points per game, but still peaking at a very nice 25.8 points per game in 1991. Robinson's offensive potential in his peak was obvious and hard to stop, as he had both height, strength, and a polished interior game to go along with it. So this category will go to David Robinson. In this category, both players were great rebounders. Robinson averaged 10.6 rebounds per game for his career, peaking at 13 per game in 1991, and 10.6 rebounds per game in the playoffs, peaking at 14.1 per game in 1998. Robinson's height and strength allowed him to be a great rebounder, and he led the league in rebounding before. But in this series, I have to say, I'm not going to make any hypothetical arguments about how many points or rebounds a player would average in an era outside of their own. But for Artis Gilmore, he clearly dominated his era when it came to rebounding. Whether that's due to lack of competition, with Mel Daniels being the only other all-time great rebounder in the ABA, and being on the tail end of his prime once Artis entered the league, or related to the ABA's faster pace, I cannot say. But it's clear that Artis was a more dominant rebounder for his era. He averaged 12.3 rebounds per game for his career, peaking at an insane 18.3 rebounds per game in 1974, and 12.7 per game in the playoffs, peaking at a ridiculous 18.6 per game in 1974. He led the ABA in rebounding an astounding 4 times, and is number 5 all-time in the NBA-ABA combined rebounding list. So this category has to go to Artis Gilmore. In this category, it's totally a wash, as neither player had much passing duties, playing a fairly pure big man role focusing on post offense, rebounding, and defense. Robinson averaged 1.4 assists per game for his career, while Gilmore averaged 2.3 assists per game for his career, slightly more. Although Robinson's peak assists per game was higher at 4.8 per game in 1994 compared to Gilmore's peak of 3.9 in 1974, either way, neither player leads significantly enough to win the category, so this category ends as a tie. In this category, it's also quite close, as Robinson is one of the most efficient players of all time, and Artis Gilmore holds the highest field goal percentage and true shooting percentage of any retired player. Although Gilmore's efficiency percentage is very hard to beat, as mentioned, he has the highest all time and never took any bad shots, Robinson also holds the lead in PER in win shares per 48. In this category, I'll have to call it a tie. In the defense category, it's also fairly close, as both were all-time great defenders at their position. Robinson has more total all-defensive selections and a Defensive Player of the Year, but keep in mind that Defensive Player of the Year did not exist in the ABA, and Gilmore did not have it for his NBA prime either. Despite this, Gilmore led the ABA in defensive win shares an incredible 4 times. When it comes to total defensive win shares, both players have a very similar amount, although Gilmore played a few more seasons than Robinson. In this category, it's close, but Robinson's more all-defensive selections and Defensive Player of the Year, with a lot of tough defensive competition in his era, like Hakeem Olajuwon, Dikembe Mutombo, Alonzo Mourning, and Patrick Ewing, gives him the edge here. So the advantage goes to David Robinson. In the awards category, both Robinson and Gilmore have an incredible resume. Gilmore's resume allows him to be considered the second most dominant player in ABA history, right after Julius the Doctor Erving. Gilmore went to 3 finals in the ABA and has a finals MVP, unlike Robinson. However, Robinson has more championships and an undefeated 2-0 record in the finals, although his second championship is far less valuable in this comparison, since Robinson was not a top 3 player on the 2003 Spurs team, that being Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, and Steven Jackson. The rest of his resume is comparable to Gilmore's, as both players have an MVP, a similar number of All-Star appearances, and a similar number of All-NBA selections. I have to say that with this category, it's too close to call, as Robinson is one of the most decorated players of his era, and Gilmore is the second most dominant player in the ABA's entire history. So this category will also be a tie. This has been another very close comparison between 2 all-time great centers. While Gilmore takes the rebounding category, Robinson takes the scoring and defense categories, with the rest being a tie. David Robinson is widely recognized as a top 10 center in NBA history, while Artis Gilmore is one of the most underrated, underappreciated players in NBA history, as most people who watch this video probably did not expect it to be so close between these two. That's why I have to make these kind of videos, to educate people about great players in the past who modern fans may not know too much about, to show people how great they were in their era. I hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next comparison video.